What's going on, guys? Aaron from Top Tier Gaming here, and today I'm coming at you with an updated best deck tier list post the new ban list that will go into effect June 5th. Of course, this ban list came very suddenly for a lot of us, and it is approaching slowly but surely to where we are able to play with this new list, and a lot of things changed. It was a pretty big ban list. Some things were like really good, and some things were kind of weird or not so great, but I do want to go over what decks I think are going to be a lot better and or, worse into the coming format, and which decks sort of find themselves in which tiers. Obviously, this is a big ban list, and of course this is going to be our national season, so that also, this is essentially our nationals deck tier list. However, this is very preliminary because we're not really in the format yet. Things could change, but this is sort of like how at the start of the format I see things going. Before we hop into it, I do want to let you guys know Discord link down below along with all of my other social media links. Also, I'm trying to hit 15,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy this Yu-Gi-Oh content and you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me out and what I do here on the channel. And without further ado, let's hop into this tier list. Alright, so the tiers are as follows, pretty simple. We have tier 1, we have tier 1.5, tier 2, rogue, and not this format. And of course, I'll be going over all of these decks. We have a whole lot of decks here on this tier list to go over. But ones that find themselves in not this format or rogue, I'm going to try to spend less time on, even though I usually end up talking about all of them for like 8 minutes each. So we're going to try to make this under 30 minutes is my goal. But yeah, let's start ranking some decks. So here we have Dinosaur, and Dinosaur is interesting because as of right now, when I'm recording this video and when it goes up, Wild Survivors isn't actually released. So it doesn't have the support. However, I think it's maybe fair to rank it with the support. I think it's definitely like at least tier 2. I think Dino is just, even though Miscellaneousaurus didn't come back off the list, I do think Dinosaur, with all the support they've gotten, is actually, it's getting, I should say, it is really strong. I think Dinosaur are in a really good spot with their new support. So yeah, I'm going to put Dinosaur in tier 2. Phantom Knight, not this format. I think Kashtira is still going to be a strong deck, and Phantom Knight obviously don't like dealing with Macrocosmos, and they just haven't been that great in a while. ABC Therion, kind of the same. Like, these decks aren't terrible, but they are either so outclassed by other things that there's almost no reason to play them. Maybe you could argue both of these for Rogue, like they're still fine, but I'm gonna say not this format. Drytron, I think, has a lot of potential. Droll Lockbird's fate is a little weird going into next format. Obviously, we were playing it because Super Heavy Samurai was incredibly strong. Now, Super Heavy Samurai is probably still going to be a deck, but how competent in the meta is it really going to be? And I think that sort of relates to how strong Droll will be, and then Droll being in the format, whether or not it is, really affects Drytron. I think tentatively I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think Drytron is really strong. Still a very, very powerful combo deck, but with Droll sort of up in the air, I think my real rating on this deck is also up in the air. And of course, with Kashtira still being popular, this deck also doesn't like Macrocosmos, so yes. Pearly, this one is something definitely a lot of people want to know because they sort of got unfairly hit on the ban list with Plump being way less accessible due to Delicious Memory being at 1. And I think it hurt Pearly a lot. Now, there's still ways to play it. I've seen like Dark World variants. I've seen people still play like the hand trap stuff and just test around with new Pearly. But overall, I don't even know if I want to put it in tier 2 with these decks. I do think Pearly's still fine, and maybe it deserves tier 2, but honestly, I don't know if I'd put it any above that, and I'm almost tempted to put it in Rogue. That being said, I don't want to write off Pearly yet. It's still pretty strong as a deck, and if you're able to establish it, it's still fine. And I think even as an engine and other things like Dark World I previously mentioned, it could be pretty nifty, so I'll put it there. Marincess, I actually almost want to put higher. Like, I know this looks weird, Marincess being tier 1.5, but with Mathmech taking the hit, I feel like Marincess is one of the better Cyburst decks, and also it did decent at some of the European Nationals as well previously in our last format. I know it took like 1 or 2 spots, I don't remember the exact amount, and I think this deck's really strong. That being said, I don't think it will see the play rate to really be at this tier, so it's another sort of tier 2 deck, I'm gonna say. And yeah, I think Marincess is gonna be one of the best, if not like the best Cyburst deck. So I have high hopes for this deck. It's a deck I really want to play in this format, but I don't think it will have the play rate to even really make it tier 1.5, but I do think it's very strong. Altergeist, not this format. Once Duelist Nexus comes out and we get the support, this deck will be a little bit better. But for now, not this format. not dinosaurs, zombies, sort of like zombie control stuff, or even zombie combo with Ballardrock. I think this deck is fine. It's maybe here. If Zombie World's not really strong in the meta, I think it's just not the deck to play, really, unless you really enjoy it. I think it's strong, but it loses to the same things that all these decks kind of do that are a little better. And I think unless Zombie World's really good in the meta, there's no reason to play. And obviously with like Kashtira and Spright being some of the better decks, I don't think zombies are something really strong in this format. Now, here we are with Kashtira, definitely one of the bigger names. I think Kashtira is still going to be tier 1. I think the hits for this deck, they stop the zone locking, which is great. And obviously, it's small consistency hits. There's only one Arise Heart, which makes the mirror match actually quite scary. I think the mirror match got, very scary for Kashtira with Unicorn being able to get the one Arise Heart. But I still think, despite all that, it's still going to be a tier 1 contender. And honestly, one of the better decks in the format for sure. Gren Maju go second stuff. This is like hard go second, or like Gren Maju decks, or like 8 axis, just like OTK Turbo. Honestly, I'll put this in Rogue. I think go second stuff is almost a little better now, just because everything else got weaker, if that makes sense. And with Super Heavy Samurai taking a hit, the 50 billion negate boards are like a little bit less, and you can resolve things like, I don't know, Raigeki or Interrupted Kaiju Slumber, whichever version of this they're going for. And there's even like Fairy Tail Luna Control that did okay somewhere a little while back. I don't know. I think this deck could be Rogue. As far as like a hard go second deck, this is fine. Harpies, not this format, needs support. Earth Machine, I love this deck, but this is going to be tentatively in not this format for ever. As long as Super Heavy Samurai does what Earth Machine did, but just better, there's almost no reason to play Earth Machine, unfortunately, because it's just worse Super Heavy Samurai. And yeah, I'm going to put it here. Fire Hydrant, what is this called? Rescue Ace. I think this deck is not as bad as I put it on other tier lists. Maybe it's even, I don't know if it's better than these decks right now though. However, when it does get its new support, I actually have a lot of faith in this archetype to be at least Rogue or tier 2. Maybe even higher, but yeah, for now I'm going to put it in not this format. Once it gets its support, there's more hope for it, but Adagnister, I think this is just not this format again. Because Kashtira is so good, and now they're almost forced to, funnel into a Rise Heart Pass, Kaijus are still going to be popular in my opinion, at least somewhat popular. I guess it depends on how strong Kashtira really is, but I do think that Adagnister sort of suffers with that, and then Mathmech Adagnister also got worse, simply because, like, Circular got hit to 1. Now, some of these, I guess you could argue for Rogue, like, because there's going to be a lot of decks in not this format if I keep ranking these so harshly. Maybe at the end, if I have too many decks in this tier, I'll push them back up to Rogue and make it, a little bit more Rogue decks in the format. Because I see that there's going to be a lot of this, like Alistair as well is not this format. Crystal Beast not this format. Like, these decks haven't been very relevant for a long time, and I don't think this format makes them relevant. Same thing with Cyber Dragon, so maybe we'll move some of these up a little bit. I'll put like ABC and Phantom Knight in Rogue as like solid options. So we did some pretty hefty changing on this tier list, and maybe even adding Nistra at Rogue, because I do think these decks right here are quite a bit worse than these. So yeah, I guess these can be considered Rogue options, and these will just be not this format. Talking about Alistair, Crystal Beast, and Cyber Dragon very briefly, they haven't been good in a very long time. This format doesn't really change anything. The top decks didn't change enough for this deck to be any of these decks to be very strong, so yeah, I'll just put those there. Now, I still think Plunder Patrol is like a really good deck, and with Droll like being less, I don't know if Droll hurts this deck too terribly hard, but the adventure stuff, obviously Droll hurts. And with Droll maybe leaving the format a bit, I do still think Plunder Patrol can be a very strong pick. It obviously still has a great Kashtira matchup. So I'm willing to put Plunder Patrol in tier 2. I do think it's a step above these decks. Border Stun, like just real Floodgate Turbo, I'll put in Rogue as well. Like, this deck doesn't see a lot of play, but every time it does, it can just get cheeky wins because it's just playing, Floodgate Turbo. So I'll put it in Rogue. Maybe it's not this format, but no, as long as like some decks are, because Kashtira is so popular, yeah, I think Border in particular is just like not worth playing. So I'll put it in not this format. B-Trooper's interesting. I had a lot of faith in this deck going into last format, or like once Syac releases. or released, because like some of the Max C-esque hand traps, the C series hand traps, got a little better in the last format. However, now with it being mostly Kashtira and like Spright and other decks again, I don't think B-Trooper's that good anymore, unfortunately. Even though they got some support in Syac, it's just not enough, and I'll put it in not this format. Eldritch I'm willing to put in Rogue, maybe even higher, because I do think Eldritch, first of all, has been performing last format, surprisingly. The regional I went to where I topped with Labrynth, there was an Eldritch in 5th, and the YCS Philly that just happened, I believe 2 different Eldritch lists top 64, maybe more. Maybe it's like a tier 2 deck, but I don't know. I think there's a trap deck that's a little better than Eldritch, which makes it, I don't know, maybe less, but Lightning Storm got put to 2. I don't know how much that really matters. That's kind of like a fake boost to back row decks. But I'll put it in tier 2. I think it's like fine. But maybe there's just too many decks in tier 2, and more of these are actually Rogue. So, you know, I'll put Eldritch in Rogue. This is Springens, not Super Heavy Samurai. Super Heavy Samurai is Wakaushi, but this is Springens. I'll put it in Rogue. I think the deck still is like a pretty silly combo deck, and Tally Ho is just one of the most wild cards. That's the card, right? It's like a Soul Charge, but like also a Rhoda or something like that. Every time that card gets activated, this deck does some crazy stuff, so I'm willing to put it in Rogue. I think it's still a nifty deck. Pure Evil Twin does not exist, so this is, you know, this was supposed to represent Pure Evil Twin, and I just keep forgetting to take it off the tier list. I'm not going to rank that. Punk, and, you know, I guess it's really weird because Punk, Gold Pride, Punk, and Gold Pride can all be decks, and I'm sort of going to lump them all together. I think maybe it's tier 1.5. I do think Punk decks are really strong and got a little stronger, because I think one of the big weaknesses Punk had last format, a couple days ago, was the fact that Droll was in the format for other decks like Super Heavy, and it just so happens to really destroy Punk. And I think other decks were a little stronger, but now I think Gold Pride Punk can really thrive. And I think Pure Punk is still like a fine enough deck as well, like Pure Punk is still solid. And Pure Gold Pride is also a pretty strong deck. In fact, I believe it got a top 64 at YCS Philly. The version that plays like tour guides and things like that we've seen a little bit in the past. And yeah, but I think Gold Pride Punk overall I think is just a little bit stronger than it has been. DDD, not this format. There's better combo decks, and there's like less difficult combo decks to play in a way. So yeah, I think this deck's like fine. Maybe it's as strong as some of these Rogue decks, but I feel like there's no reason to really play this over any of the other decks. So yeah, I'll just put it here. Ninja, not this format. Maybe Rogue. It's weird because Ninja's like a meta call for Kashtira. And Kashtira, I think, will still be a good deck, but I don't think it will be so good where you can play Ninja. And even where we see Kashtira, like, the top of Tier 1 status, not like a one-deck format, but definitely where Kashtira is heavily first place, we still don't see Ninja. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in not this format. Agents, interestingly enough, I think this deck got a boost. I haven't tested this deck with the new support. I've seen some of it, so I don't want to say too much. But Apple Dragon is a huge boost for this deck that came out in Cyberstorm Access. And then Gen X ally Birdman came off the ban list, which historically was Agent's best friend because of how he works with like Shine Ball, essentially like a free body. And yeah, I wonder if that can be abused in a level 3 tuner. I wonder if that helps any of their lines. I don't know. I'm not going to put it in Rogue based off of this, but just something to think about. Virtual World, I'm going to put in Rogue actually. Like, I usually put this in not this format. And you could say like it doesn't really have any matchups that are super good for it. However, I went to a regional in Mendenhall like less than a month ago in the last format, and Sword Soul Virtual World won the regional. And you know, that doesn't say everything how a deck represents in a format. Like any deck can like win a regional on a really good day. But I think it does say something that maybe like Shen Shen Chuche is still presentable. I'm gonna put it in Rogue for that reason. I do think it's better than a lot of these decks, but only by a little, so it'll be like the bottom of my Rogue. Weather Painter, not this format. Like, you just need a format where you really need to floodgate. Like, Tier Limit format, I think Weather Painter was like an okay Rogue deck, but there's way better Dimension Shifter decks to play than Weather Painter, so it'll go there. Pendulums, I think Pendulum get a huge boost. I'm gonna put this deck in Tier 2. Now, I think this deck was real strong, like Power of the Elements format, like right after with Darkwing Blast, and we got the Pendulum support, and it was just like a pretty strong, competent deck. Nothing from that has changed, besides the fact that Kashtira were like able to zone lock, and they could take 2 Pendulum zones and make this deck unplayable. And essentially, one Pendulum Zone and make this deck unplayable. But I feel like that will happen a lot less now overall. It's still like possible, but maybe Pendulum, especially with 3 Draco face-off, can do something a little better. So I'm interested to see if Pendulum can like adapt and really, you know, sort of make what I'm saying come to fruition. I do think this deck's stronger than these rogue decks by a bit. Like, this deck was extremely solid before, and now like Droll might be leaving the format. Again, a lot of this tier list is going to be based on what Droll is doing, because that was sort of the determining factor for what decks were good in Syac almost. But yeah, I think this deck also got something off the ban list in Draco face-off, so maybe this deck can actually compete a little better. Scareclaw, not Scareclaw. No, yeah, Scareclaw. Maybe tier 2, maybe Rogue. I think this deck has been seeing more success as an engine than a deck. I think it's a lot better than some of these Rogue decks though, so I'll put it in tier 2. Salad, I'll put in not this format. However, when it gets the support, I can see it jumping up maybe a tier or 2. I don't know if even with the support, it's better than Marincess. I think Marincess right now might just be the queen of Cyberse. Potentially, Mathmech is definitely not out of the format, but maybe there's more reason for sure to play Marincess than the other Cyberse decks. I think that's true. Like, Marincess has always been my favorite Cyberse deck by far. I think its playstyle is the more, like, one of the most interesting ones. It's the only Cyberse deck that doesn't funnel into access code as well. So as long as Marincess exists, it's really hard to choose to play Salamangreat. Maybe if Gazelle comes to 3 and the new support, maybe it'll be on par. But for now, I'm going to say not this format. Exosister. Now, this deck, I think, did get like leaps and miles better. Is that a phrase? I'm pretty sure that's a phrase. This deck I was testing before I went to the regional I did with Labrynth, and it was one of my options because I think after Syac with Sakitama and Aratama, this deck got a lot better. It's so much more consistent. It has another 1-card starter, and while the format isn't really shaped up to help it, I think as like a 1-card starter, almost Cyberse-like deck, it's pretty good. And I think if this deck is good in the meta, where like decks like Tearlament are popular, or if like, you know, Drytron or Marincess were top tier contenders, or decks that touch the graveyard a lot, this would actually be like a tier 1.5, that's the wrong deck, a tier 1.5 or tier 1 deck. However, because it's just playing like the 1-card starter sort of control deck, similar to Marincess, I'm going to say it's Rogue. Maybe it's up to tier 2 even without its gimmick being popular. I think this deck is actually really strong with the new support. I didn't take it because of Droll and Lockbird, but if Droll is less popular, maybe it's tier 2. Like, I just think it's better than most of these decks in Rogue, but I don't know if it's tier 2. That being, you know, I'm gonna put it in tier 2. I think it is just better than these Rogue decks, and even though there's not many decks that like proc its gimmick, I'm just gonna put it at like the top of Rogue. I think this deck is really strong, maybe on the line of tier 2 and Rogue. I think this deck is much better than just its gimmick, but yeah, I'll put it in Rogue. Paleozoic Tearlaments I think get a lot better. I know this says Paleo. I'm gonna put it in Rogue. I did have like a locals win with this deck, and I've been testing with it a bit. I think the engine is still one of the most strong like engines in the game. However, Kashtira is still really good. We're still gonna need defensive cards where this deck sort of struggles. But it's definitely higher than not this format now. I think like Tearlaments get a lot better with everything else getting weaker, and therefore Paleo tier gets a little better. So yeah, I still don't think Gishki's very good. I think we've seen without Elf, this deck is not playable really. You can play it, but it's not like a Spright variant you'd want to play, and I don't think it's good enough as a pure deck, so we haven't seen this deck pop up at all. I think it's fair to put this here. Dinomorphia, I want to put in tier 2. Maybe that's a little high, but I think this deck has a lot of, like, if Kashtira wasn't one of the best decks this format, I think this deck would be like really strong, an incredible option. In Cyberstorm Access, it got the counter trap as support, and I do think this deck is really strong. There was a top 16 at YCS Philly with Dinomorphia, so congratulations to him. That's, you know, pretty impressive because Dinomorphia hasn't been doing much. However, I think post Syac, this deck is a real threat, and it's very strong. One of the better trap decks in the format. I'd say it's better than Eldritch, even though it got less tops. I think people are just like, they don't want to try Dinomorphia because of, you know, time rules and how Dinomorphia's gimmick works. However, I think most Dinomorphia games, you either win or lose very quickly, and I almost never find myself going into time with this deck, so I don't know. I think more people should try this deck and they'd find it's extremely powerful, so I'm willing to put Dinomorphia in tier 2. Super Heavy Samurai is one of the more interesting ones because I don't really know where it's going to go post-ban list. I think Scarecrow was a huge hit, and I don't know if it's going to be able to keep up with the other tier 1 decks in my opinion. Maybe I'll still put it in tier 1.5. It can still do exactly what it did before, but like a little bit less because no Scarecrow. Maybe it's tier 2. I don't even know. I really don't know where I want to put this, so this is going to be very tentative, preemptively. I don't want to say, I'm going to put it in tier 2. I don't want to say the Scarecrow hit killed the deck, but it definitely is a significant hit. I'm going to put it in tier 2 at one of the higher end of tier 2. I think this deck is not gone, but there's like other decks that actually have more consistent 1-card combos, and yeah, I just don't really know where it's going to go. We're going to have to see on this one, so yeah. Spright, I'm going to go ahead and put in tier 1. I think this deck, losing a starter is something. You have one less 1-card starter in Spright now, and also it's one less way to push through interruptions. So a starter hit does hurt to 2 a little bit, but really almost nothing has changed with Spright. And then of course, the Runic engine didn't get hit at all. So like Runic Spright especially is still going to be popular. Evil Twin Sprite's going to be good. I think Spright is going to be one of the best decks of the upcoming format. And I think it's pretty obvious because it didn't really get hit at all besides a starter, and everything else around it got weaker. So yeah, I think that is just, a perfect amount of ingredients for Spright to be a tier 1 deck. Same with Branded, actually. I think maybe it's now Branded's time to shine. It didn't get hit at all except Expulsion, and I think, everything else getting weaker just makes Branded better, right? Like that's sort of how it always is. Now maybe Branded is because it will be targeted as one of the better decks. It's going to have the Ash Blossom problem again. However, I don't know. I think Branded is either a strong tier 1.5 or a tier 1. I'm going to put it in tier 1.5 because anytime this deck does jump to tier 1, people prepare for it, and this deck has really hard counters, and it just slides back here anyways, so I'll put it here. Hero, I'm going to put in Rogue right now. I think they're okay. Maybe they're tier 2, but I think they're just okay. Like, Darklaw is one of the biggest things for this deck. DPE and Darklaw are like the biggest things for Hero, and as long as Macro is like part of the format already and it's like hurting everything else, there's less reason to play Darklaw, so I'll put it in Rogue. Dragon Maid, Rogue as well. It's like a solid like Dragon Bestial control deck you can play, but I think it's just less good than regular Bestial control right now, so please Konami give us Chambers Dragon, that'd be great. Dragoon stuff, I think Dragoon stuff might get a little bit, does it get better or worse? I don't know. I think it's still just like Rogue. I think like Dark Magician or like Guru with Dragoon is still like a locals pub stomp deck. Dragoon in anything can be like okay, especially with Droplet out of the format. That's something people don't give Dragoon like enough credit for. And like Branded can play Dragoon too, and he's just a powerhouse in that deck. So I think Dragoon turbo decks, especially with Droplet not being in the format because of Kashtira, is just like a stronger card than normal, so I'll put him in Rogue. Infernity, not this format. Labrynth, I'm going to put in tier 1. Like, this deck lost Gamma for the furniture version, but that's like a small price to pay for like how everything else got hit. Eradicator's still in the format, Skill Drain didn't get hit, so I think Labrynth has been proving itself slowly to be one of the best decks this format in Syac, and I think it will just continue going forward. It does lose hard to Ash, but, if they shift more to Trap Labrynth again, then that loses to Ash less. And I think this is a deck people are going to have to prepare for. It's just super, super strong. I just got a regional top with it, and I have a lot of faith in this deck that it can be one of the best decks in the current format. Madolche, they're solid rogue, but they don't really beat anything in the top decks. Like, if Glass Souffle isn't destroying the meta, then there's no reason to play Madolche, really. But it's like a strong Earth, like, pile deck with Vernia Sylphs and has a strong combo. I would really like Madolche to get some form of support, though. They did get Orange Light back to 2, but I think I'd want it at 3 before I considered, like, playing this deck again. Haha, funny deck. It can just stay there. Manadium, I'm going to put in tier 2. I think it's a really strong combo deck. That, before was just outshined by the decks in front of it, but these decks all got weaker, and I think that just inherently makes Manadium a little better. If Droll leaves the format, that also just helps Manadium. Like, we could be shifting more back to board breakers instead of hand traps, right? Like, that's one of the more, unknown things going into next format, but I'm willing to put Manadium in tier 2. Tri-Brigade Spright, I'll put in tier 2. I think that deck is just really strong. I don't think it's the best version of Spright, but it's still good. Nothing happened, right? Like, nothing got hit to make Tri-Brigade Spright less good, right? Like, at the 250th, it definitely had success, and I think it should still have a decent amount of success, unless something got hit that I'm not thinking of. No, right? I think Tri-Brigade is a little better. Even Bird Up, if you consider this for Bird Up, they just got Recital Starling back to 3, which doesn't really matter, but it's a buff. So yeah, I'm willing to put Tri-Brigade in tier 2. Burning Abyss is not this format. Even when Beatrice is at 3, I think it'd just be Rogue at best. Probably not even Rogue, so it's just not this format. Shark stuff. This deck is actually more competent than people give it credit for. I think it's, like, Kragan control stuff is pretty solid overall, but I think there's just better decks that do, like, its gimmick better. Like, combo decks and control decks like Exosister, or one-card combo decks like Marincess. So I'll say not this format, but maybe it's Rogue. I think Shark is not terrible. Dark World, I want to put in tier 2 because this deck's engine is still one of the strongest in the game, I think. And also, depending on how Pearly and Dark World might end up becoming friends and be like solid enough together, which would boost Dark World. And if Droll leaves the format, there in theory should be less Shifter already. If these are like the best decks, there should be less Shifter. Only Kashtira should really be playing it in a format like this one's shaping up to be, and it'd be a side deck pick. Unless Super Heavy Samurai is still insanely popular, and I don't think it will be as popular. This is going to be one of the things I go back to this tier list, and we really see how wrong or right this pick was. But Dark World in a format where Droll might be less popular, or Shifter might be less popular, is an amazing thing for Dark World. And, you know, again, Pearly got hit. That might be good for the Dark World engine. And I think we might see this deck be tier 2, but if hand traps leave the format even a little bit, I wouldn't be surprised if Dark World actually goes up. But this deck has hard counters similar to Branded, so if this does become popular, it just slides down the tier list like normal. Mathmech, I still want to put in tier 2. I don't want to put it any lower than Marincess's tier, even though I think Marincess might be the better Cyberse deck finally. I'm kind of hoping for that, because I love this deck and I hate this deck. But I'm trying to be fair, and I think Mathmech losing to Circular is bad, especially if Droll stays in the format, because this deck gets hurt by Droll infinitely more, because the only way you're getting to Circular most often is Signet Mining or Small World, and that really hurts. Now maybe they'll shift to the Firewall stuff, but not only did Mathmech lose Circular, which was bad, it lost Gamma, which was big for Mathmech in my opinion, because it stopped Droll and Shifter, which were two cards that hard counter this deck very heavily. And it's obviously just a very strong hand trap overall, which this is a hand trap deck. And I think Mathmech took a bigger hit than, you know, they think. And I think Branded got a little better, and Labrynth, especially Furniture Labrynth, is good, which means the Bestials and Bell will still be part of the format, which dominate this deck. So I think this deck has some hard counters in the meta, and I think it got a little bit weaker, obviously, with 2 Circulars being gone. So I'll put it in tier 2, but I think it might be less good than Marincess. This is, you know, Mikanko got some support. I think it's like a fine enough combo deck. I'll put it in Rogue. You don't see this deck a lot, but it is very strong when it does. It still has one of the best end boards in the game by far, I think. That doesn't lose to Dark Rulers, so I think when this deck gets to go first, it's just insane. Maybe I'll put it in tier 2 for that reason. I'm talking about Mikanko Libromancer. Maybe if Droll dies down, that we can see that deck play again. But it is tough into Kashtira, so I don't know. It's either Rogue or tier 2. I don't know. I'll put it in tier 2. I think this deck's just so strong going first. And solid enough going second that it might be okay, especially if Droll dies down. Naturia Runic, I'm going to put this in Rogue. I think this deck got hit heavily, and as far as Runic variants go, there will be less reason to play this version than ever. One tree is just really bad for the Runic engine, I think. That's really tough. Like, Runic, I think, will be good for the meta, so maybe it's like tier 2. Maybe this is a little heavy-handed, because one tree you can maybe make work, but I don't know. The deck just loses so much with one tree, and it loses its biggest power play, in my opinion, which was Hugin discard tree. That's not going to be as consistent, so you're always, like, going minus off your Hugin now, and I feel like other Runic variants, particularly Spright, are much better, which means there's less reason to play this. But, and then Beast is looking like an okay card, but I feel like with Labrynth and Spright being some of the better decks, maybe, and Kashtira, like, Beast is less good, so this was already falling out of favor, and I think it just gets worse, so I'll put it in Rogue. Sky Striker, I'm going to put preemptively in tier 2 because they just got a second engage back, and 3 multi-roll, and Kagari's here. Other things got weaker, or like we have 3 Kagari, obviously, and everything else got weaker, so I think Sky Striker could be one of the better control decks that is just, I mean, this deck, you know, sometimes it just slips under the radar, and then it will just top an event, so I'm going to preemptively put this in tier 2. I mean, 2 engage How much does it really change? Does multi-role really matter? I don't know, but I think this deck, you know, it didn't really get to shine with linkage yet, but I think this deck could be pretty powerful, so I'll put it in tier 2. Rika, I'm going to put it in 1.5. This deck did not get hit. I thought Rika was really strong in Cyberstorm Access format. Like, I just thought it was a really strong deck, but Super Heavy Samurai was a little better as the combo deck, and they both lost to the same card, so like, why play Rika, essentially? Now, I feel like Rika might be better than Super Heavy Samurai, and I think Rika is an insane, strong deck. It never gets the play rate it deserves, but this is like a Nationals winning deck, and it's just super, super strong. Like, this deck is so good, and people really don't give it enough credit, but I think Rika could be one of the better decks in the format. Maybe tier 2. I'm willing to, like, bump Rika up a bit because I feel like other people just aren't really going to respect this deck as much, and it's going to be very powerful. Adamancipator, Rogue or not this format. This deck hasn't seen play in a while. Runic, this isn't Runic Stun, but I think Runic variants in general are just very strong next format. Again, everything else got weaker, and Runic did not get touched. 3 Fountain to 2 Fountain is nothing. Runic did not get touched at all. This will find homes paired with Spright, maybe still paired with Kashtira as a version. I don't know if that was ever like the play, but maybe. It's still going to be okay with Naturia Runic. I think Runic variants of Plunder Patrol will still be good, and maybe even as its own deck with Floodgates will still be strong. Mostly as a Spright variant, in my opinion. It's just so good, but yeah, Runic I think will be tier 1. It's so strong. Spellbook, we'll put this in not this format, just hasn't done anything. Fluanderese is either tier 2 or 1.5. I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think Fluanderese is just solid, really strong. I think it had like a good Kashtira matchup to an extent because it didn't really lose to some of the stuff it had. And with Kashtira maybe not being as good as it was previously, maybe Fluanderese takes a small hit there. It has some problem versus trap decks. It does not like going up against Branded in my experience, so I don't know. I think it's strong, but maybe just tier 2. Sword Soul, do I want to put this in 1.5? We don't know what Danglong's going to do, right? Is Danglong going to be something so good that boosts Sword Soul here? I don't know. I'm going to preemptively put it in tier 2. I don't know if it'll be as strong as these decks, but I think Sword Soul doesn't lose to Droll regardless. It doesn't lose to Shifter, which made it actually a decent pick in Syac format in my opinion. But now with Danglong coming back off the ban list and Apple Dragon being here, maybe this deck is actually just really solid now. I'm going to put it in tier 2, but I wouldn't be surprised if it goes to 1.5. Tearlaments I think get a lot better. I'll put them in tier 2 as well. Again, with Cash probably going to be played less. Maybe that doesn't even happen though, right? I think Cash got the least hits between Super Heavy Samurai and Pearly, but it got more hits than all these decks around it, right? So I think it will be played less because these decks are a little bit stronger now. But if it does still be being played like the same, then Tearlaments will struggle there. But I do think Tearlaments are a lot better now after Cash maybe taking a step down. But yeah. Bestial Control, I also think this deck's really strong. Like, I've just seen Bestial Dragon stuff be good on like Dueling Book and in some IRL events, but I haven't seen it actually do many like topping things, so maybe it's just tier 2 as well. I don't know. I really want to put this deck in like tier 1.5. I think this deck's really good with Dispotter and stuff like that. Maybe this is a hot take. Maybe it's not as good as I'm making it out to be, but I think this deck's really good. And with Droll leaving, maybe it's even better, right? But they did lose Gamma. Losing Gamma does stink. Wow, they did lose Gamma, and I always thought Gamma was one of the best cards in Dragon Link. Wow. I'll put it in... I'm still going to leave it at 1.5. Trap Tricks, I think, is like a solid deck. I'll put it in tier 2. I think it's better than most of these Rogue decks, to be honest. And then Generator, I'll put in Rogue, because they're, like, pretty okay, and I think they're comparable with some of these decks, and better than a lot of these not this format decks. So, that's going to be it for this ban list. I unfortunately don't think I got it under 30 minutes. Did I say ban list? I mean tier list. Yeah, these just take a long time for me because I like to explain all the decks and the reason I'm putting them where I'm putting them and how they fit in the format. But yeah, if you disagree with anything, leave it down in the comments below. I'll be sure to read them. Of course, this format is still wide open. We're not even in the format yet. This is just a preemptive, sort of tentative look at what I think could be good. We'll sort of see how it goes, you know, going forward. This is our Nationals format after all, so it's an important sort of format we're in. And that's going to wrap it up for me. I hope you guys enjoyed. This has been Aaron from Top Tier Gaming. Bye, YouTube.